In a small, tight-knit town, newly appointed Chief of Police Taylor Scott faces her toughest challenge yet, not just in commanding her team, but in changing the culture of a police department steeped in old habits and biases. When Taylor, a black woman in a position of authority, is pulled over by two of her own officers in what should have been a routine traffic stop, things take a shocking turn. What starts as a simple misunderstanding quickly spirals into a confrontation that tests everything Taylor stands for: her leadership, her integrity, and her resolve to make real change. But that's just the beginning. As tensions build within the department and a dangerous hostage situation unfolds, Taylor must rely on her instincts and her team, especially an unlikely officer who's been on thin ice. Will her team come together in time to save lives and rebuild trust? Or will this crisis push the department past the point of no return? Stick around to find out what happens next in this gripping story of leadership, accountability, and second chances. Don't forget to hit the like button if you're ready to dive into the story, and be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. What would you do in Chief Taylor's shoes? Let us know, and enjoy the journey. The crisp autumn air brushed lightly against Taylor Scott's face as she drove down Interstate 12. The faint scent of pine and the soft hum of her car engine offered a sense of peace in the otherwise tense life she led. Being the new chief of police for Brookwood, a small town tucked away from the bustling cities, was both an honor and a challenge. It was a job she had fought for, and now every day felt like another battle to earn respect. Still, this early morning drive was her sanctuary, a time when she could gather her thoughts before stepping into the chaos of leadership. Taylor had spent over 2 decades in law enforcement. She had started as a patrol officer in Chicago, a city where survival and smarts went hand in hand. She'd seen it all: dirty politics, institutional racism, blatant corruption, but somehow she managed to rise above it. Not with rage or recklessness, but with determination and discipline. Now, at 42, with short-cropped natural hair, sharp eyes, and the confidence of a leader who had seen the worst of humanity, she was tasked with transforming the very culture that had shaped her career. Brookwood was nothing like Chicago. The town was quiet, peaceful on the surface, but Taylor sensed the tensions that simmered underneath. Small-town politics often meant that change came slowly, and the predominantly white community had yet to fully embrace her as their police chief. It didn't matter that she was qualified. She was a black woman in a position of power, and for some, that was a tough pill to swallow. This morning, Taylor wasn't thinking about any of that. For now, it was just the road, the fiery colors of the autumn trees lining the highway, and her thoughts on what to tackle at the office. There had been several minor complaints from the department, a few incidents of excessive force that didn't sit right with her. She intended to get to the root of the problem soon. She flicked on the radio, letting the soft jazz notes fill the car. Just a little longer, she thought. Let me have this quiet a little longer. The Brookwood Police Department was a small building on the edge of town, with neatly manicured lawns and a brick facade that gave off a sense of tradition. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but welcoming. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Lieutenant Brian Mason walked through the halls. Brian had been with the department for 15 years, rising through the ranks by being dependable and loyal. He was one of Taylor's few supporters, though even he had trouble fully understanding the pressures she faced. Brian stepped into Taylor's office, his face grim. "Morning, Chief. You ready for another day of babysitting?" Taylor smiled but shook her head. "More like cleaning up messes. What's the latest?" "Couple things," Brian said, flipping through his notes. "We've got an internal affairs complaint. Another one involving Officer Jared Myers." Taylor's smile faded. Jared Myers. He was a young officer with potential, but his attitude was all wrong. Too much aggression, not enough restraint. She had seen his type before, eager to prove something but not in the right way. "What did he do this time?" she asked. Brian shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Same old thing. Pulled over a couple kids on the south side, roughed them up a bit when they didn't comply fast enough. Nothing broken, but there's some bruises. Parents are upset. Taylor rubbed her temples. It's the third complaint this quarter. This is getting ridiculous. Brian hesitated before responding. You know how it is. Some of the guys, they're just not used to your style of leadership. Myers especially. He thinks you're too soft. Too soft. Taylor leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling. This isn't Chicago, Brian. We don't need to be playing tough guy. We need to build trust. I know, but you've got to understand, these guys, they've been doing things a certain way for years. It's hard for them to adjust. Taylor sighed. She knew all too well what he meant. Change was never easy, and for some the change she represented wasn't just about policy, it was about identity. All right, she said, standing up. I'll talk to Myers.
He needs to understand that this isn't a game.
Brian nodded, but Taylor could see the doubt in his eyes. Even he wasn't sure how long she could keep control of the department without alienating more officers. She just hoped it wouldn't take a full-blown disaster to make them see reason. Jared Myers strutted through the precinct like he owned the place. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who knew his power and knew how to abuse it. Myers wasn't inherently bad, Taylor thought. He just hadn't learned to temper his confidence with caution. Chief wants to see you, Brian said, crossing paths with Myers in the hallway. Myers raised an eyebrow, his smirk almost mocking. Oh, really? What did I do this time? Just get in there, Brian muttered. As Myers stepped into her office, Taylor studied him. He was in his early 30s, his short sandy hair neatly combed, his uniform crisp. But there was an arrogance in his stance, the kind of arrogance that came from thinking he was untouchable. Officer Myers, have a seat, Taylor said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Myers sat down, leaning back like he was at a poker game, not a disciplinary meeting. So, what's this about? Taylor folded her hands on her desk, her eyes never leaving his. I've had another complaint. This time, from the parents of 2 teenagers you pulled over last night. They're saying you used unnecessary force. Myers shrugged. They were acting suspicious. I was just doing my job. Suspicious. Taylor's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Did they pose a threat to you or anyone else? Myers hesitated. Not exactly, but they didn't comply when I asked them to get out of the car. I had to make sure they weren't carrying. Taylor leaned forward. And what did you find? Drugs, weapons. Myers shifted uncomfortably. No, but that doesn't mean… Let me be clear, Officer Myers, Taylor interrupted. This department doesn't tolerate excessive force. You've been on the job long enough to know how to de-escalate a situation without resorting to violence. We're here to protect and serve, not intimidate and escalate. Myers clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of the chair. With all due respect, Chief, this town isn't exactly crime-free. We need to show strength. If we don't, these kids are going to run all over us. Taylor stood, her eyes locked on his. Strength isn't brutality, officer. It's control. It's knowing how to handle a situation without making it worse. I need you to understand that if you can't operate within those boundaries, there won't be a place for you in this department. Myers' face reddened, but he nodded. Understood. Good. Now, I'm placing you on probation for the next 2 weeks. Any more complaints, and we'll have to reassess your position here. Do I make myself clear? Myers nodded again, this time with less defiance. Yes, Chief. As he left her office, Taylor sighed deeply. The battle to change the culture of the department was going to be harder than she thought. Myers wasn't the only one who needed to change, he was just the most obvious. She needed to dig deeper, root out the core problems, and find a way to lead her officers without losing them entirely. Later that day, Taylor decided to step out for lunch. She needed a break, and the local diner on Main Street had the best coffee in town. As she cruised through the quiet streets of Brookwood in her black SUV, she spotted a police cruiser pulling up behind her. The lights flashed and the sirens blared. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been speeding. Her vehicle's registration was up to date. She hadn't made any traffic violations as far as she could tell. Confusion turned to suspicion as the cruiser persisted, signaling for her to pull over. Taylor's brow furrowed. She knew every officer in Brookwood, and she hadn't called for any traffic stops today. Pulling onto the shoulder, Taylor watched through her side mirror as two officers stepped out of the cruiser. Her stomach dropped when she recognized them, Officer Jared Myers and his partner, Officer Eric Johnson. This wasn't right. Something was off. But Taylor remained calm. As they approached, she rolled down her window, her eyes narrowed slightly. "Good morning, officers," Taylor said, her voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Myers, wearing dark sunglasses and a smirk, ignored her question. "License and registration," he said bluntly. Taylor's jaw tightened. She complied, handing over the documents, but her mind was racing. Why were they pulling her over? Johnson circled her car, glancing inside. Taylor could sense their unease, but she couldn't pinpoint the reason. "What's your business here?" Myers asked, his tone sharp. Taylor raised an eyebrow. "I'm heading to work." Myers stared at her license for a long moment, then passed it to Johnson, who was now pacing around the car like a predator. They whispered something to each other, their eyes darting back to Taylor occasionally. The tension grew thick. Taylor's fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, but she wasn't afraid. She was angry. This wasn't a routine traffic stop, this was something personal. Finally, Myers stepped back to the window. His hand rested on the holster of his gun. "Step out of the vehicle." Taylor blinked. "Excuse me?" "Step out of the vehicle," Myers repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Taylor took a deep breath and complied. As she got out, the two officers moved closer, their hands still resting on their holsters. "What's going on here?" Taylor demanded, her voice firm but controlled. Myers' smirk deepened. "We've got reports of a vehicle matching this description being involved in illegal activity." Taylor's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her cool. "Illegal activity," she repeated, incredulous. "You're mistaken." Johnson crossed his arms, glancing at Myers. "Well, be the judge of that." The situation had escalated far beyond a simple misunderstanding. Taylor could see it now. They didn't recognize her. They saw only what they wanted to see, and they were about to learn a hard lesson. The air between Taylor and the two officers felt electric, as if the situation could snap in any direction. Officer Myers stood just inches from her, trying to mask his nerves with bravado. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but Taylor could feel his unease. This wasn't about a simple traffic stop anymore, it was personal. Taylor, her back straight and head held high, resisted the urge to correct them. Revealing herself as the chief of police could defuse the situation in seconds, but she didn't want to take the easy way out. These officers needed to understand their mistake on their own. "We've got a problem here," Myers said, his voice low but dripping with misplaced authority. "Step away from the car." Taylor's instincts, honed by over 2 decades in law enforcement, told her that they were trying to bait her, to get her to react emotionally. But Taylor knew better than to give them the satisfaction. "You'll need to explain what illegal activity I'm suspected of," Taylor said calmly, crossing her arms. "I haven't done anything wrong." Myers chuckled, an edge of arrogance in his voice. "You think you're above the law? We're the ones in charge here." Taylor could feel her patience slipping. She glanced over at Officer Johnson, who stood by the passenger door of her vehicle, his arms crossed and a suspicious look on his face. He hadn't said much, but he was backing Myers up all the same. Johnson paced around the car, peeking inside. His eyes darted from the dashboard to the back seat, as if he were looking for something incriminating. "You got something in there?" Johnson asked. His voice was gruff, impatient. Taylor shook her head. "There's nothing in my car. You know that." But they didn't listen. They didn't want to. She could see it now, their assumptions, their biases. In their minds, she wasn't their chief. She was just another black woman on the side of the road, someone they felt entitled to intimidate. And that was their mistake. The minutes ticked by slowly as the officers whispered to each other, occasionally casting sideways glances at Taylor. She stood there, outwardly calm, but inside she was seething. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and part of her wanted to let them dig their own graves. But another part of her an instinct rooted in fairness, knew that this was bigger than just their mistake. It was about the entire system. Taylor's mind raced through the options. She could pull rank, but what then? Myers and Johnson would be humiliated. Sure. But would they learn anything? Would the rest of the department change? Probably not. If anything, It might deepen their resentment. So she let them continue for now. Officer Myers finally broke the silence. "We're going to need to search your vehicle." Taylor raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Johnson's mouth twitched, but he kept silent, deferring to Myers. "There's been reports of drug trafficking in the area," Myers replied. "Your car matches the description. We're just doing our job." Taylor narrowed her eyes. "You don't have probable cause?" Myers shrugged. "We'll see about that." Without waiting for permission, Myers leaned into the car, his gloved hands rifling through her belongings with the casual carelessness of someone convinced they wouldn't find anything but still hoping for a reason to justify their behavior. Johnson circled the vehicle, checking the license plate and examining the tires as if that would reveal some hidden secret. Taylor stood still, her hands clasped behind her back, watching them make fools of themselves. They found nothing, of course. There was nothing to find. "Nothing here," Johnson finally said, his voice tinged with disappointment. He straightened up, glancing at Myers for guidance. Myers, for the first time, looked uncertain. His bravado slipped just a little. "We're going to need you to come down to the station for questioning." For the first time since the stop began, Taylor allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Just as Myers took a step toward her, a pair of headlights cut through the fading daylight. A black SUV rolled up behind the police cruiser, its engine purring quietly as it came to a stop. Both Myers and Johnson turned to see who was arriving, and Taylor watched as their expressions faltered. Out stepped Deputy Chief Michael Walker, his tall, imposing figure immediately catching the officer's attention. Walker, a seasoned veteran with decades of experience, wasn't just any cop. He was Taylor's direct superior, and the look on his face could have stopped a freight train. Walker's boots crunched against the gravel shoulder as he approached. His gaze went straight to Taylor, who stood calm and composed, then shifted to the officers. "What's going on here?" Walker asked, his voice cool but with an edge of authority that brooked no nonsense. Myers straightened, his hand instinctively dropping from his holster. Johnson fidgeted awkwardly, casting quick glances between Walker and Taylor. We pulled her over," Myers stammered. "Vehicle matches the description of one involved in suspicious activity." Walker raised an eyebrow, his eyes flicking to Taylor. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Taylor could tell Walker already knew exactly what was going on, and that the officers had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. "Suspicious activity," Walker echoed. His tone was dangerously neutral, as though daring the officers to continue their story. "Yeah," Johnson chimed in, trying to salvage the situation. "We were just following protocol. Nothing personal." Taylor felt her lips press into a thin line, resisting the urge to laugh. "Nothing personal. Everything about this was personal." Walker folded his arms across his chest, his eyes narrowing. "You ran her license." Myers opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, as though realizing too late what Walker's question implied. Johnson stared at the ground, suddenly very interested in his shoes. "I take that as a no," Walker said, his voice dropping lower, each word carrying the weight of impending consequences. Taylor's silence was deliberate. She wanted the officers to feel every second of their mistake before she stepped in. They hadn't run her plates, hadn't checked her ID, hadn't even thought to treat her with the same respect they would have given to anyone else. To them, she was just a suspect in a car, not the leader of their department. Finally, Walker turned to Taylor, his face softening just slightly. "Chief Scott, is everything okay here?" The silence that followed was deafening. Myers and Johnson froze, their expressions going from confusion to horror as the realization settled over them like a heavy blanket. "Chief Scott?" Taylor crossed her arms, meeting the eyes of both officers. "I think we've got a misunderstanding," she said coolly. Walker let out a breath, shaking his head slowly. "A misunderstanding looks like a failure in judgment to me." The blood drained from Myers' face, his hands twitching at his sides as if trying to undo what couldn't be undone. Johnson's bravado crumbled completely, his arms hanging uselessly by his sides. Taylor, feeling the weight of the moment shift, took a step closer to Myers and Johnson. "You didn't even check who I was before pulling me over. You saw a black woman in a car you didn't recognize, and that was enough for you." Johnson opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Myers swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Walker for some kind of lifeline, but there was none coming. "You didn't think," Taylor continued, her voice calm, but carrying the full force of her authority. "You acted on assumption, and because of that, you've put yourselves and this department in a very precarious position." For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of their actions pressed down on the two officers, the reality of what they had done sinking in deeper with every passing second. Walker stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with restrained anger. "Do you know what kind of damage this could do? You've just harassed the chief of police, your boss, under false pretenses." Myers' face paled even further, if that were possible. "We didn't know, sir. That's the problem, Officer Myers," Walker snapped, his voice cutting through the evening air like a whip. "You didn't know because you didn't do your job. You let your biases guide you." Taylor watched the officers squirm, but she wasn't finished. "I've spent my entire career earning the right to wear this badge," she said, her voice measured but sharp. "And I expect every officer under my command to do the same." Myers shifted uncomfortably. "We made a mistake, Chief." Taylor nodded slowly. "Yes, you did. And now there are going to be consequences." The relief that had begun to creep into their expressions faded immediately. Taylor could see the fear in their eyes, the dread of what was coming next. "I'm not going to fire you," Taylor said, her voice steady. "But make no mistake, this isn't going to be brushed under the rug. You'll be suspended, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation." Johnson looked like he was about to collapse, his face drained of all color. Myers remained stiff, but the defiance in his posture was gone, replaced by a kind of resigned shame. "Get back to the station," Walker ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Well, deal with this formally." The two officers nodded meekly and hurried back to their cruiser, their shoulders slumped as they drove away. As the sound of the sirens faded into the distance, Taylor stood beside Walker, watching the horizon darken. She wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Walker glanced at her, his voice softer now. "You okay?" Taylor nodded. "I'm fine. It never ends, does it?" Walker sighed, resting a hand on her shoulder. "No, it doesn't. But you handled it." Taylor let out a long breath, her gaze drifting to the fading sunset. For now, the drive back to the station was silent. Taylor kept her eyes on the road, her thoughts swirling in a maelstrom of emotions. She had seen this kind of thing before, officers letting their assumptions get the better of them, but this time it hit differently. It wasn't just another case of police misconduct. It was personal. It was her. She had fought her whole career to change the culture in law enforcement, but days like today reminded her just how steep the climb was. Her own officers had looked at her, a black woman driving a nice car, and assumed the worst. They hadn't even checked her ID, hadn't run her plates. They didn't care about protocol. Their judgment had been clouded by something far more insidious. Pulling into the parking lot of the Brookwood Police Department, Taylor turned off the engine and leaned back in her seat, staring at the building. The brick walls felt colder than usual, the familiar badge on the entrance seeming almost mocking. How many times had she told herself that she could make a difference? How many times had she promised that her presence as a black woman in charge would inspire others, change hearts, and open minds? Yet here she was, still fighting the same fight. Would it ever be enough? Taylor finally stepped out of her car and made her way into the station, her boots echoing in the empty hallway. The department was mostly quiet now, the night shift was just starting, and the hustle and bustle of the day had slowed. She could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a stark contrast to the roaring thoughts in her head. As she reached her office, she found Lieutenant Brian Mason waiting for her by the door. He stood up straight when he saw her approach, his usual easygoing expression replaced with concern. "Chief, I heard about what happened," Brian said, his voice low. Taylor gave a tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "News travels fast around here, doesn't it?" Brian looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Are you all right? I can't believe Myers and Johnson." Taylor sighed and unlocked her office door. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she motioned for Brian to follow her inside. Once they were both seated, she leaned forward on her desk, clasping her hands together. "Brian, What do you honestly think about the state of this department? Taylor asked. Brian blinked, taken aback by the sudden question. What do you mean? I mean, Taylor said, her voice a little sharper than she intended, how deep do you think this problem runs? What Myers and Johnson did tonight wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of something bigger. Brian hesitated. Chief, I won't deny that there are issues. But things are changing slowly. You've already made an impact. Taylor appreciated his optimism, but she wasn't convinced. She rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of the day's events pressing down on her. I don't want this to be just another incident that gets swept under the rug. This department has to be better than that. We have to hold ourselves accountable. Brian nodded slowly, clearly trying to gauge how best to support her. You're right, but you're not in this alone, Chief. You've got allies here, people who respect what you're doing. Taylor gave him a weary smile. I know, but sometimes it doesn't feel like enough. Brian watched her for a moment before standing up. Let me know if you need anything. Okay, I'll be handling the paperwork for Myers and Johnson's suspension. Thanks, Brian, Taylor said, though her mind was already miles away, contemplating the next steps. As Brian left the room, Taylor glanced out the window, the night stretching before her like a long, uncertain road. Later that night, Taylor sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The lights in her small house were dim, casting long shadows on the walls. Her home had always been her refuge, a place where she could escape the pressures of her job, but tonight the silence felt heavy. She thought about her rise to the position of chief of police. It had taken years of hard work, sacrifices, and moments where she had to prove herself over and over again, even when she shouldn't have needed to. There had been plenty of times where people like Myers had underestimated her, either because of her gender or her race, or both. She had always dealt with it quietly, with patience. But today had shaken her. Taylor set her cup down, the ceramic clinking softly against the wooden table. Her mind drifted back to Myers and Johnson. They weren't just reckless, they were dangerous. What they had done wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a culture that she had promised herself she would change. And now she wasn't so sure she could. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Deputy Chief Michael Walker's name. Her mentor, her friend. He had always been there when she needed advice, especially during the toughest moments of her career. Without hesitating, she dialed his number. Taylor, Walker's deep voice answered after the second ring. I figured I'd be hearing from you. Taylor leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. I needed to talk. Walker chuckled softly on the other end. I get it. It's been one hell of a day? That's putting it mildly, Taylor replied, her voice softer now. Walker, how do we fix this? How do we change a system that seems so resistant to change? There was a pause on the other end. Taylor could almost hear Walker gathering his thoughts. Taylor, I've been doing this for over 30 years. I've seen every kind of cop there is, from the ones who genuinely want to serve to the ones who are just looking for power. Changing a department, hell, changing a system takes time. You've already made progress, even if you can't see it. Taylor opened her eyes, staring at the dark kitchen in front of her. I'm just so tired of fighting. I know, Walker said, his voice gentler now. But if anyone can do this, it's you. You're not in this alone. You've got people in your corner, Taylor sighed, feeling a small bit of comfort in his words. Thanks, Walker. I needed to hear that. Any time, he replied. Now get some rest. You're going to need your strength for whatever comes next. The next morning, Taylor arrived at the station, her resolve renewed, but still tempered by the weight of the previous day. She had always been good at compartmentalizing, keeping her emotions in check while she worked, but today felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that she couldn't shake. As she entered the station, she spotted Internal Affairs Officer Rachel Davis at the front desk, already hard at work. Rachel was one of the sharpest investigators in the department, known for her meticulous attention to detail and no-nonsense attitude. If anyone could handle the fallout from Myers and Johnson's actions, it was Rachel. Taylor approached her, offering a small nod. Morning, Rachel. Rachel looked up from her paperwork and smiled slightly. Chief, I heard about what happened last night. Taylor sighed. Seems like everyone has. Rachel's expression sobered. I'm heading up the internal investigation. I've already spoken to a few of the witnesses who saw Myers and Johnson pull you over. Needless to say, it's not looking good for them. Taylor nodded. I didn't expect it to. Rachel glanced around the station, then lowered her voice. Chief, I know you want to do the right thing here, but you need to be careful. Some of the officers aren't happy about what's happening. They see it as a sign that you're too strict. Taylor's brow furrowed. Too strict. This is about following protocol and treating people with respect. How is that too strict? Rachel leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You're changing things, Chief. And change scares people, even if it's for the better. Taylor appreciated Rachel's honesty, but it didn't make the situation any easier. I know. But we can't keep sweeping things like this under the rug. It's time for accountability. Rachel nodded, her face serious. I'll handle the investigation. Don't worry about that. But just be aware that not everyone in the department is going to see things your way. Taylor bit her lip. She had known this would be an uphill battle, but hearing it confirmed by someone as trusted as Rachel made it all the more real. I understand, Taylor said finally. Keep me updated on the investigation. And Rachel? Thanks. Rachel gave her a small smile. Of course, Chief. We're in this together. As the day wore on, word of the investigation spread through the department like wildfire. Taylor could feel the shift in atmosphere the moment she stepped into the briefing room for the afternoon meeting. Officers were whispering to each other, casting furtive glances in her direction. It was clear that the incident with Myers and Johnson had rattled everyone. As she stood at the front of the room, preparing to address her team, she could sense the unease. Some officers looked uncomfortable, others downright resentful. But she couldn't let that deter her. Good afternoon, everyone, Taylor began, her voice steady and commanding. As many of you have already heard, we are conducting an internal investigation into last night's events. Officers Myers and Johnson have been suspended pending the outcome of that investigation. There were murmurs throughout the room, and Taylor could see the tension in the faces of some of her officers. But she pressed on. Let me be clear, Taylor continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. This investigation is not about singling anyone out. It's about accountability. Every one of us wears this badge because we've sworn to uphold the law and serve our community with integrity. That means following protocol, respecting the people we serve, and holding ourselves to the highest standards. One of the officers, Officer Mark Reynolds, raised his hand. Chief, with all due respect, some of us feel like this is. Well, it feels like you're coming down on us too hard. Myers and Johnson made a mistake, but they're good cops. Taylor's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. Officer Reynolds, I understand your concerns. But being a good cop isn't just about doing the right thing most of the time. It's about doing the right thing all of the time. We can't afford to let mistakes like this slide. Reynolds frowned but didn't argue further. Taylor could feel the tension in the room, but she refused to back down. This department is only as strong as the trust we build with our community, Taylor said, her voice firm. And that trust begins with us. I expect every one of you to hold yourselves to the highest standards, just as I hold myself to them. We're not perfect, but we can't afford to be careless. Not anymore. As the meeting wrapped up, Taylor could see the mixed reactions on her officers' faces. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained skeptical, their arms crossed and faces tight with frustration. But Taylor wasn't here to be liked. She was here to lead. The next few days passed in a blur of tension as the internal investigation into Officers Myers and Johnson deepened. The entire Brookwood Police Department felt like it was on edge, with whispers behind closed doors and uneasy glances exchanged in the hallways. Taylor could feel the eyes of her officers on her, some of them filled with support, others with resentment. She knew that pushing for change had always meant making people uncomfortable, but it didn't make the weight of it any easier to bear. At her desk, Taylor flipped through the investigation reports Rachel Davis had compiled so far. Witness statements were damning. There was security footage from nearby traffic cameras showing how Myers and Johnson had followed protocol at first, but escalated without cause. No drugs, no weapons, just assumptions. Assumptions about her, their chief, no less. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Lieutenant Brian Mason again, his face more serious than usual. "Chief, you got a minute?" Brian asked, stepping into her office without waiting for an answer. "Come in," Taylor said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Brian sat down, folding his hands in his lap. "Rachel's got more information on the investigation. It's not looking good for Myers and Johnson." Taylor nodded, unsurprised. "I figured as much. What else have you got?" Brian hesitated for a moment, then continued. "It's not just them, though. Some of the other officers. They're getting rattled by all of this. You've probably noticed the mood around here. Some of them think the investigation is going to lead to bigger changes they aren't ready for." Taylor leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "So what they think, I should just let this slide?" Brian shook his head. "No, it's not that. They just don't understand why it's become such a big deal. To them, Myers and Johnson made a mistake, sure, but they think this investigation is overkill." "That's the problem," Taylor said, her voice growing sharper. "They don't see the big picture. This isn't just about Myers and Johnson screwing up once. It's about a pattern of behavior. If we don't address it now, it'll only get worse." Brian frowned, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I get that, Chief. I do. But some of these guys, they feel like you're coming down on them too hard. They're starting to push back." Taylor's stomach tightened. She had known that pushing for reform would meet resistance, but hearing it from Brianone, of the few people she trusted, made it all the more real. "And what do you think?" she asked quietly. Brian looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I think you're doing the right thing. But I also think you need to be careful. Some of these officers, they've been here a long time. They're not going to take kindly to being told they're doing things wrong." Taylor clenched her jaw. If they're doing things wrong, then they need to hear it. Brian stood up, sighing. "I agree. Just don't forget that you've got allies here, too. Not everyone's against you." Taylor watched him leave, the weight of his words settling heavily on her shoulders. Allies or not, she knew that the road ahead was going to get even rockier. 2 days later, Taylor sat in a sterile conference room facing Officer Jared Myers. His once confident demeanor had taken a noticeable hit. His eyes, usually sharp and brimming with arrogance, were dull now. His lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Derek Fields, sat beside him, speaking in low tones. Myers avoided looking directly at Taylor, instead focusing on the table in front of him. Rachel Davis sat to Taylor's left, her tablet on the table, ready to present the findings of the investigation. The internal investigation had concluded, and the hearing today would determine Myers' immediate future with the department. "We've reviewed the evidence," Rachel began, her voice crisp and professional. "The footage shows a clear escalation on your part, Officer Myers, without any cause. There was no probable cause to conduct a search, and your behavior toward the chief was not only inappropriate, but also unprofessional." Derek Fields cleared his throat, leaning forward. "With all due respect, the officers were acting on what they believed was a credible tip. Mistakes were made, yes, but to suggest that Officer Myers acted maliciously or with intent to harass is unfounded." Taylor watched Myers closely, trying to gauge his reaction. There was no doubt that Myers had made assumptions about her the moment he saw her behind the wheel of that car. But she wasn't interested in firing him out of spite. This wasn't about personal vendettas. It was about accountability and change. Rachel continued, unfazed by Fields' argument. "The department's rules on conduct are clear, Mr. Fields. Officer Myers and his partner escalated the situation based on assumptions, not facts. And if they're willing to do that to their own superior, we have to question how they're treating civilians." Myers finally spoke, his voice quiet and strained. "We didn't know she was the chief. We thought we were doing our job." "And that's exactly the problem," Taylor said, her voice calm but firm. "You didn't take the time to verify who I was. You didn't follow proper procedure. Instead, you acted on instinct, and that instinct was wrong." Myers clenched his jaw, but he said nothing more. His lawyer continued to argue for leniency, but Taylor had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to fire Myers, but he wasn't going to get away without consequences. After what felt like hours, Taylor finally spoke again, her decision final. "Officer Myers, You're suspended without pay for the next 4 weeks. You'll also be required to complete a full retraining program, focusing on de-escalation and implicit bias. Upon completion of the program, you'll be reassessed before being allowed to return to duty. Myers looked like he wanted to argue, but he kept his mouth shut. Derek Fields gave Taylor a tight nod before gathering his papers and leaving the room with his client in tow. Once they were gone, Rachel turned to Taylor. "You made the right call." Taylor sighed, rubbing her temples. "Maybe. But will it be enough?" Rachel didn't answer. Neither of them knew for sure. The following day, Taylor faced Officer Eric Johnson in a similar hearing. Unlike Myers, Johnson's demeanor was different. He seemed genuinely remorseful, his shoulders slumped and his eyes downcast. He wasn't trying to defend himself the way Myers had. He wasn't angry, he was ashamed. "I just want to start by saying that I'm sorry, Chief," Johnson said quietly. "I know what we did was wrong. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. I went along with Myers because that's what I've always done." Taylor sat back in her chair watching him. Johnson had always struck her as someone who went with the flow, never causing too much trouble, but never standing out as a leader either. He followed orders, even if those orders weren't always right. "I appreciate your honesty, Officer Johnson," Taylor said, "but that doesn't change the fact that you let this happen. You didn't question Myers, you didn't follow proper protocol, and you didn't do your job." Johnson nodded, his face pale. "I know, and I deserve whatever punishment you give me." Taylor leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "You do, but I also believe that people can learn from their mistakes. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to be suspended without pay for 2 weeks, and like Myers, you'll be required to go through retraining. If you show me that you've learned from this, you'll be allowed back on duty." Johnson looked up, relief flooding his face. "Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down." "I hope not," Taylor said, "because next time there won't be a second chance." In the days following the hearings, the department seemed more divided than ever. Some officers felt that Taylor had been too lenient, believing that Myers and Johnson should have been fired outright. Others thought she had been too harsh, especially on Myers, who had been popular among his peers for his assertiveness on the streets. Taylor, however, wasn't interested in being liked. Her job wasn't to win popularity contests, it was to lead. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing tension within the department. Rumors began to spread whispers that Taylor was too strict, too focused on changing things when, in the eyes of some officers, there wasn't much that needed changing. It was the classic resistance to reform, the same pushback she'd seen in departments all over the country. One morning, as Taylor made her way through the hallways, she overheard 2 officers talking in hushed tones near the break room. "I don't know, man," one of them said. "The chief's got it out for us. All this talk about accountability. It's like she doesn't trust us to do our jobs anymore. She's trying to turn this place into one of those departments you see on TV." The other officer muttered. "Next thing you know, we'll be handing out tickets for jaywalking." Taylor paused just out of sight, her chest tightening with frustration. It wasn't just the resistance to change that bothered her, it was the way they seemed to be missing the point entirely. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about making sure they understood their responsibility to the community, to the people they were supposed to protect and serve. That afternoon, Taylor called a meeting with Deputy Chief Michael Walker in her office. She needed to get a sense of how deep this divide ran, and more importantly, what she could do to bridge it if that was even possible. Walker sat across from her, his arms crossed, his usual calm demeanor slightly tense. He could sense the strain on her, the weight of leadership pressing down hard. "They're pushing back," Taylor said, not bothering with pleasantries. "They think I'm being too harsh." Walker raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think?" Taylor rubbed her temples. "I think I'm doing what needs to be done. But I also know that if I push too hard, I risk losing them entirely." Walker sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Change isn't easy, Taylor. You knew that when you took this job." "I did," Taylor agreed. "But knowing it and living it are 2 very different things." Walker studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You're right to hold them accountable. Myers and Johnson needed to face consequences for what they did. But you've got to make sure the rest of the department doesn't see this as an attack. They need to understand that this is about making them better, not tearing them down." Taylor nodded, her gaze fixed on the papers scattered across her desk. "I don't want them to be afraid of me. I want them to respect me, and more importantly, I want them to respect the badge." "Respect is earned," Walker said quietly, "and you're earning it even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Taylor let out a long breath. "I hope you're right." It was just after 7 p.m. when the call came in. Taylor had barely sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee when her phone buzzed, interrupting the brief moment of peace she'd managed to carve out after another long day. The voice on the other end of the line was tense, sharp with urgency. "Chief, this is dispatch. We've got a hostage situation at a convenience store on the south side of town. A man's barricaded himself inside with 3 hostages." Taylor shot to her feet, her heart rate spiking. "Anyone injured?" "Not yet, but the suspect's armed and he's making threats. SWAT's been called, but they're 20 minutes out. You'll want to get here as soon as you can." "I'm on my way," Taylor replied, already grabbing her keys and heading for the door. The calm, peaceful evening was shattered as her mind switched into full gear. This was the kind of situation she'd trained for her whole career, but it was also the kind that could go wrong in the blink of an eye. As she raced through the streets of Brookwood, sirens wailing, her mind spun through everything that could go wrong. The suspect was desperate. Desperation made people dangerous. And if the officers on the scene didn't handle it carefully, things could escalate fast. But it wasn't just the situation she had to worry about. Her department was already on shaky ground. The tension from the investigation into Myers and Johnson still lingered, and she knew some officers were questioning her leadership. This would be their first real test since the incident. How they handled it and how she led them through it would either bring them closer together or deepen the divide. She couldn't afford failure. When Taylor arrived at the scene, the red and blue lights of patrol cars flashed across the darkened street. Officers were positioned behind their vehicles, weapons drawn, while a small crowd of onlookers gathered at the edges, held back by caution tape. The convenience store loomed ahead, its windows dark, the neon open sign flickering ominously. Lieutenant Brian Mason approached her as soon as she stepped out of her car. His face was tense, but his voice steady as he gave her a quick rundown. "It's a guy named Marcus Langston, local small-time criminal, mostly petty theft. Apparently, he tried to rob the store, but things went south when the cashier fought back. He's got a gun and 3 people inside the cashier, a customer, and a teenager who walked in right before it all started." Taylor nodded, absorbing the information. "Any demands?" "Hez asking for a car to get out of town," Brian said. "Says if we don't give it to him, he'll start shooting." Taylor's jaw tightened. It was a classic situation: desperation, threats, and a man with nothing to lose. But there was something else. The teenager inside. If Langston got scared or angry, the situation could spiral out of control fast. "Have we made contact?" Taylor asked, her eyes scanning the scene. "We've been talking to him through the store's landline," Brian replied. "Hez agitated, but we've managed to keep him talking. So far, no one's hurt." Taylor felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. The situation was still fragile. "I want to talk to him." Brian's eyebrows shot up. "You, Chief? We should wait for SWAT to get here. They're trained for this." Taylor shook her head. "We don't have time. Every minute we wait, the more unstable this guy becomes. If we can keep him talking, we can buy ourselves more time to get those people out safely." Brian hesitated, clearly unsure, but finally nodded. "All right, I'll set up the call." As Taylor moved to the mobile command unit, she couldn't help but notice the looks from some of the officers on the scene, some uncertain, others skeptical. This was the first real crisis they'd faced under her leadership, and it was clear not everyone was convinced she was making the right call. But she couldn't afford to doubt herself. Lives were on the line, and there was no room for hesitation. Sitting in the command unit, Taylor put on the headset. The line to the convenience store was already connected, and the faint sound of breathing echoed on the other end. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a man's voice, shaky but defiant, broke through. "Who is this Marcus?" Langston demanded. "This is Chief Taylor Scott of the Brookwood Police Department," Taylor said, keeping her tone calm but firm. "I understand you're in a tough spot right now, Marcus, but I want to help you get out of this safely." There was a pause, then a bitter laugh. "Help me? How are you going to help me? I'm stuck in here, and if I walk out, you'll shoot me down like a dog." Taylor leaned forward, focusing on every word. She needed to build trust, to get him to see her as someone who could offer a way out. "No one's getting shot, Marcus. That's not what we want. But I need you to help me too. Let's figure this out together, so no one gets hurt." Another silence. Then Marcus' voice came through again, more agitated this time. "I don't trust cops. You think I'm stupid I know how this end?" Taylor's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not here to lie to you, Marcus. I'm here to tell you that there's a way for you to come out of this alive, with everyone safe. But you've got to work with me." A low growl of frustration came through the line. "I didn't mean for it to go this way. It was supposed to be easy, just get in, get out. But now I'm screwed." Taylor seized on the vulnerability in his voice. "I know you didn't mean for this to happen, Marcus. Things got out of control, but we can fix this. Let the hostages go, and we'll talk about getting you out of there safely." For a moment, there was only the sound of heavy breathing on the other end. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice breaking. I don't know if I can do that. They're all I've got." Taylor's mind raced. He was scared, cornered, and desperate. She had to convince him that letting the hostages go was his best option. "Listen to me, Marcus. Holding those people inside isn't going to make this better. It's only going to make things worse. But if you let them go, we'll take that as a sign that you want to work with us. It's your first step toward making this right." Silence stretched again, and Taylor held her breath. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely audible. "I'll let one of them go." Taylor's heart surged with hope. "That's good, Marcus. That's a good first step. Who's coming out?" "The kid," Marcus replied. "He doesn't deserve this." Taylor nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see her. "All right, I'm sending an officer to the door. They'll take the kid to safety, okay?" Marcus grunted in agreement. Taylor quickly relayed the instructions to Brian, who sent an officer forward. Minutes later, the door to the store creaked open, and a terrified teenager stumbled out, his eyes wide with fear. Taylor watched as the boy was rushed to safety, her heart pounding. It was a small victory, but they still had 2 more hostages inside. And Marcus Langston was far from stable. As the situation inside the store continued, Taylor's focus remained razor-sharp on the negotiation. Marcus was still talking, still teetering on the edge of panic and surrender. But they weren't out of the woods yet. Just as Taylor was about to respond to Marcus' latest demand, Brian's voice cut in through her earpiece. "Chief, you're not going to believe this, but Myers just showed up." Taylor blinked in surprise. "Myers has suspended." "I know," Brian said, his tone incredulous. "But he's here, and he says he can help. Says he knows Marcus personally used to bust him for petty crimes back in the day." Taylor's mind raced. Jared Myers was the last person she expected to see tonight, especially given everything that had happened. But if what he was saying was true, if he knew Marcus Langston, then maybe he could help de-escalate the situation. After a moment of hesitation, Taylor decided. "Bring him in." Minutes later, Myers stepped into the command unit, his face pale but determined. Taylor didn't know if it was desperation to prove himself after the recent suspension or genuine concern, but whatever it was, Myers was here. And he might be the key to ending this standoff without bloodshed. "Chief," Myers said, his voice steady, "I know Marcus. He's been in and out of trouble for years, but he's not a killer. He's scared, and I think I can talk him down." Taylor studied Myers, searching for any sign of the arrogance that had defined him before. But all she saw was someone willing to step up, to make amends for past mistakes. She nodded. "All right, Myers, I'll let you talk to him. But if this goes south, I am pulling you out immediately." Myers didn't argue. He took the headset and began talking to Marcus, his voice calm but firm. "Marcus, it's Jared Myers. You remember me?" There was a long pause, then Marcus' voice crackled through the line, surprised but wary. "Myers, what the hell are you doing here?" "I'm here to help you, man," Myers said. I know you didn't mean for things to go this way. I've seen you screw up before, but you've never hurt anyone. You don't want to start now." Marcus' voice wavered. "I don't know, man. I don't know what to do." Myers leaned forward, his tone becoming more urgent but still controlled. "You let one of the hostages go. That was the right move. You're doing the right thing, Marcus. Just let the other two go, and we can figure this out." The tension in the command unit was palpable. Taylor watched Myers closely, ready to jump in if needed, but so far he was handling it. And then, miraculously, Marcus agreed. "Okay," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, he'll let them go. Just don't shoot me." Myers' voice softened. "No one's going to shoot you, Marcus. Just walk out with your hands up, and we'll get you out of this safely." Taylor's heart pounded as the door to the convenience store opened again. The remaining hostages emerged first, followed by Marcus, his hands raised in surrender. Officers moved in quickly to take him into custody, but there was no violence, no gunfire. It was over. Taylor let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Against all odds, they had pulled it off. And Myers, despite everything, had stepped up when it mattered most. After the scene cleared, Taylor found herself standing alone in the no-empty parking lot, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The crisis had ended peacefully, and for that, she was grateful. But what lingered in her mind wasn't just the success of the operation, it was Jared Myers. She had been prepared to write him off as a reckless, arrogant cop who didn't belong in her department. But tonight, he had proven that he could do better, that he could be better. And in doing so, he had reminded her of why she had taken this job in the first place. People could change. Departments could change. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was possible. As Taylor watched Myers talking with Brian and the other officers, she knew that tonight had been a turning point. Not just for Myers, but for the entire department. Trust had been broken in the past, but tonight had begun to mend it, piece by piece. It wouldn't be the last crisis they faced, and there were still officers in the department who resisted the changes Taylor was pushing for. But for the first time in a long while, Taylor felt something she hadn't felt since the day she was appointed chief. Hope. The morning after the hostage situation, the atmosphere at the Brookwood Police Department felt different. There was still the usual hustle and bustle as officers prepared for their daily briefings and filed their reports. But underneath it all, there was a quiet sense of something having shifted overnight. Taylor sat at her desk, reviewing the final report on Marcus Langston's arrest. It had been a close call, but they had managed to resolve it peacefully, and all the hostages had made it out safely. More importantly, the way the department had handled the situation had marked a turning point. Officers who had once been divided over Taylor's leadership now seemed to see her in a different light. Just as she finished reading through the report, there was a knock on her door. It was Lieutenant Brian Mason, as steady as ever, but today his expression was lighter, almost relieved. "Chief, just wanted to give you a heads up. Word about last night's incident is spreading through the department," Brian said, stepping inside. "And it's good news this time. People are talking about how well things went." Myers stepping up really surprised a lot of folks. Taylor leaned back in her chair, feeling the tension she hadn't realized she was holding begin to melt away. "What's the general sentiment?" she asked, knowing how important the officers' trust was to the department's cohesion. Brian sat down across from her, rubbing the back of his neck thoughtfully. "Honestly, I think last night changed a lot of minds. There's been a lot of talk about how you handled the negotiation and how you brought Myers in, even though he's suspended. They're seeing you as more than just the person cracking down on them. They're seeing a leader who's willing to trust her people even after mistakes." Taylor considered his words, her mind flashing back to the moment when Myers had shown up. She had taken a gamble by letting him help, but it had paid off. More than that, it had allowed the department to see that redemption and growth were possible, even for someone like Myers, who had been on the wrong path. "That's good to hear," Taylor said, though she tempered her relief. "But we're not done yet. The real challenge will be keeping this momentum going. We can't let one good night undo the work we still need to do." Brian nodded in agreement. "I think people are starting to get that. You've got more allies than you realize, Chief." Taylor smiled at that, a small but genuine smile. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the department wasn't just surviving. It was starting to thrive. Later that afternoon, Taylor called Jared Myers into her office. His suspension was still in effect, but after last night, she knew they needed to talk. Myers entered the room with a cautious expression, as if unsure of what was coming. He stood at attention, waiting for her to speak. "Have a seat, Officer Myers," Taylor said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Myers sat down, but he didn't look entirely comfortable. There was still a lingering wariness in his eyes, a trace of the arrogance she had once seen in him, now replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. "I wanted to thank you for your help last night," Taylor began, watching his reaction closely. "You stepped up when it mattered, and because of that, we were able to end the situation peacefully." Myers looked down at his hands, nodding slightly. "Thank you, Chief. I knew Marcus. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Taylor studied him for a moment before continuing. "You did the right thing. But I also want you to understand that what you did doesn't erase your past mistakes. You're still suspended, and when you come back, you'll still be required to complete your retraining. The way you handled yourself last night shows that you've got potential, but it also shows that you need to make that your standard, not the exception." Myers' shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded. "I get that. I'm not going to make excuses for what happened before. I messed up, but I'm trying to do better. That's all I can ask," Taylor said, her tone softening just a little. "But understand this, Myers earning back trust isn't something that happens overnight. You'll have to prove yourself, not just to me, but to the entire department." "I will," Myers said, meeting her gaze. "I know I've got a long way to go, but I want to make things right." Taylor could see the sincerity in his eyes. Maybe he really had learned from his mistakes. Only time would tell if he could maintain that growth, but for now, she was willing to give him the chance. "Good," Taylor said, standing up and offering her hand. "Well, see where you are when you finish your retraining." Myers shook her hand, his grip firm but respectful. "Thank you, Chief." As Myers left her office, Taylor allowed herself a moment to reflect. This was what leadership was about, not just making the tough calls, but also giving people the chance to learn from their mistakes. It wasn't easy, and it didn't always pay off. But sometimes it did, and that was enough to keep her going. The department was buzzing with activity the next morning as Taylor made her rounds. There was still plenty of work to do, cases to solve, reports to file, training to conduct, but the undercurrent of division that had plagued the department for so long seemed to be fading. Taylor walked past Officer Eric Johnson, who was busy filing paperwork at the front desk. He looked up as she passed, his face still marked by the guilt and shame of his involvement in the Myers incident. But instead of avoiding her gaze like he had in the days following his suspension, he gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Taylor paused, offering him a quick but meaningful smile. "How's it going, Johnson?" Johnson swallowed, straightening up. "Good, Chief. Just trying to catch up on some of the reports I missed while I was out." "You're doing a good job," Taylor said, her tone light but sincere. "Keep it up." Johnson nodded again, the weight of his past mistakes still visible on his shoulders, but there was also a flicker of hope. He wasn't the most confident officer, but he was learning, slowly but surely. As Taylor continued down the hallway, she saw more faces, some familiar, some new, but all of them were starting to look at her with a different kind of respect. Not the forced respect that came from a title or a position of power, but the kind that was earned over time through actions, through consistency. By the time Taylor reached the briefing room, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: optimism. The department was still far from perfect, but it was changing. And for the first time, Taylor believed that the change was real and lasting. Several weeks later, Taylor stood on the steps of the Brookwood Town Hall, the autumn air crisp and cool around her. A small crowd had gathered in the square, a mix of local residents, officers from her department, and a few members of the media. The hostage situation had garnered a lot of attention, and the town's leaders had organized a small event to recognize the police department's efforts in resolving it peacefully. Taylor had been asked to speak, and as she stood in front of the microphone, She could see the expectant faces of the crowd watching her. She took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank you all for being here today. It means a lot to me and to the entire Brookwood Police Department to have your support." There was a smattering of applause, and Taylor smiled, feeling the warmth of the community's approval. But she wasn't here to bask in praise. She was here to speak the truth. Last month, we faced a serious crisis. A man's life was in danger, along with the lives of 3 innocent hostages. But because of the bravery and dedication of the officers in this department, we were able to bring that situation to a peaceful resolution. More applause, but Taylor held up her hand to quiet the crowd. "But I want to be clear," she continued, her voice steady but firm. "That situation wasn't just about one night. It was about the trust we've been building slowly, day by day, between this department and the people of this town.
Trust isn't something that comes easily.
It's something we have to earn, not just once, but every day." She glanced out at the crowd, her gaze settling on a few familiar faces, members of the community who had been skeptical of her leadership when she first arrived. People who had questioned her ability to lead, to bridge the gap between the department and the town it served. "Brookwood has had its share of challenges," Taylor said, her voice rising slightly. "And so has this department. But what you've shown is that when we work together, when we listen to each other, we can overcome those challenges. We can build something stronger, something better." The applause this time was louder, more heartfelt. Taylor smiled, feeling the energy of the crowd wash over her. For the first time since she had taken the job as chief of police, she felt like she wasn't just leading a department. She was part of a community that was finally starting to trust her and the officers under her command. As the applause died down, Taylor stepped away from the microphone, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She knew there were still challenges ahead. Reform didn't happen overnight, and there would always be obstacles. But for the first time, she felt confident that they could meet those challenges head-on together. That evening, Taylor sat on her front porch, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, and the cool autumn breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. It was peaceful, something she hadn't allowed herself to enjoy in far too long. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Deputy Chief Michael Walker. Walker heard about the event. "Sounds like things are finally turning around. Proud of you, Taylor." Taylor smiled as she typed a response. "Taylor couldn't have done it without you." As she set the phone down, Taylor let herself relax, the weight of the past few months finally lifting. The department had faced its struggles, and there was still plenty of work to do. But they were moving forward, and that was all she could ask for. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more crises to manage. But for now, Taylor allowed herself to savor this small victory. Because for the first time in a long time, she knew they were heading in the right direction. And that made all the difference. Thank you for watching and following the journey of Chief Taylor Scott as she navigates the challenges of leadership and justice. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more compelling narratives like this one, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We've got plenty more stories lined up that explore courage, growth, and the power of change, just like this one. Your support helps us keep bringing you content that matters. Thanks again, and see you in the next story. Lean on your team, and don't be afraid to keep pushing for change, even when it's hard. As Denise left the office, Ryan felt a sense of peace. The future of the department was in good hands. It was time for him to step back and let the next generation lead. With his retirement officially announced, Ryan took a few weeks to reflect on Jordan's proposal. The idea of taking the community safety initiative to a national level intrigued him, but he was also ready for a quieter life after years of public service. He spent more time with his family, enjoying the slower pace, but the thought of leaving the work behind nagged at him. One evening, Ryan found himself sitting on his back porch, the sun setting over the city skyline. The phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Jordan still waiting on you, old man. Time's ticking. Ryan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Jordan never gave up on a fight. That night, Ryan made his decision. He wasn't ready to walk away from it all just yet. The work they had started was too important, and if there was a chance to make a lasting impact on a national scale, he wanted to be a part of it. The next morning, Ryan called Jordan. "All right, I'm in. Let's do this." Jordan's voice was filled with triumph. "I knew you couldn't resist. This is going to be big, Ryan. We're about to change the game." With the decision made, Ryan found himself in Washington, D.C., meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials from across the country. The National Pilot Program was being rolled out in 10 major cities, and Ryan was instrumental in helping to shape its implementation. His experience in building the initiative from the ground up gave him a unique perspective, and his input was invaluable as they adapted the program to fit the specific needs of different communities. Jordan, as always, was right there with him, leading the charge from the legal side and ensuring that the program stayed true to its original goals of fairness, justice, and community empowerment. As the months passed, Ryan found himself energized by the work. He had thought he was ready for retirement, but this new mission gave him a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were immense, but so were the rewards.
He watched as communities began to embrace the new model as officers and residents, and as the seeds of change spread from city to city.
2 years into the National Pilot Program, the results were undeniable. The Community Safety Initiative had reduced violent incidents, built stronger bonds between law enforcement and residents, and empowered communities to take control of their own safety. The program was hailed as a success, and plans were already underway to expand it to even more cities. Ryan, now in his mid-60s, knew it was finally time to step back for good. His work was done. He had helped lay the foundation for a new era of policing and community collaboration, and he had no doubt that the leaders who followed would continue to build on that legacy. As he stood on the steps of the Capitol, watching the latest round of national reforms being signed into law, Ryan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for fairness, and for a better future. And now that future was being realized. Jordan stood beside him, grinning. "Well, old man, we did it." Ryan smiled, his eyes reflecting both pride and relief. "Yeah, we did." They stood there together, watching the crowds below, knowing that their fight had been worth it. The road had been long, the challenges immense, but they had built something lasting, something that would shape the future for generations to come. And in that moment, Ryan knew that while his journey as a public servant was over, his legacy of justice, reform, and hope would live on. Ryan Carter had officially retired from his role as Chief of Police and had successfully completed his work on the National Pilot Program. Now, standing on the balcony of his home in Denver, he gazed out over the city that had shaped his life. After decades of service, he was finally stepping away from the day-to-day grind of law enforcement. But it didn't feel like the end. In many ways, it felt like a new beginning. Without the constant pressures of his old position, Ryan found himself reconnecting with old hobbies and passions that he hadn't had time for in years. He spent more time with his family, his wife Elena, and their 2 grown children, Tyler and Sophia. The past few years had been especially hard on them with Ryan's intense focus on work, and now he wanted to make up for lost time. One sunny afternoon, Ryan and Elena took a walk through the park, something they hadn't done in what felt like ages. The air was crisp, the leaves falling gently around them, and Ryan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. "You finally have time to slow down," Elena said with a smile as they strolled along the path. Ryan nodded. "It feels strange, but it's nice. I think I forgot what it was like to just be present." Elena squeezed his hand. "You've earned it, but I have a feeling you're not done yet." Ryan smiled, knowing she was right. Even in retirement, his mind still buzzed with thoughts about how he could continue making a difference. But this time, he would do it on his terms, without the constant demands of his old job weighing him down. A few months into his retirement, Ryan was approached by a local university to teach a course on ethical leadership and policing reform. The idea intrigued him. He had spent years putting these principles into practice, but now he had the opportunity to pass that knowledge on to the next generation of leaders. The thought of stepping into a classroom full of eager students, young people, who would one day be responsible for shaping the future of law enforcement, gave Ryan a renewed sense of purpose. He accepted the offer and began preparing for the course. On his first day at the university, Ryan felt a twinge of nervousness as he walked into the lecture hall. The students sat quietly, some of them looking excited, others curious, all waiting for the former police chief who had gained national recognition for his reforms. "Good afternoon," Ryan began, standing at the front of the class. "My name is Ryan Carter, and am here to talk to you about the future of policing." He paused, scanning the room before continuing. "But before we talk about the future, we need to understand the past, the mistakes, the challenges, and the moments when we didn't get it right. Because if we don't learn from those moments, we'll be doomed to repeat them." The room was silent as Ryan spoke, but he could feel the students' attention. Their interest piqued. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. "I can't say I didn't see this coming. Are you thinking about it?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it?" Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. "You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jordan replied. "It's a big step, but I think it's the right one." As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability, was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.